You're listening to the Street Cred podcast, the show laser focused on helping streetwear entrepreneurs turn their side hustle into a full-time job. I'm Elijah Delporte, and I need to be honest with you. This is the second take of this podcast. The first time, we're going to get into the topic of customer acquisition. But the first time, I don't know what, but I simply wasn't feeling it. I had to stop halfway through because I feel like I was just maybe what's the word? Well, just like this right now, I wasn't able to find my words, and maybe when I can't find my words, I like to default to being a bit of a broken record for what everyone has already said. And I really don't like doing that. And when I find myself doing that, I need to remind myself to stop, take a step back. And so now I just went for a walk only as far as the kitchen to get myself a cup of tea, and I've sat down to do take 2 of this podcast, and I think this one's going to be a good one because I have a tendency to overcomplicate things. However, I think that this episode is going to provide you a lot of value, and I hope that I don't overcomplicate it. I think I can present it to you now in a way that's simple enough, that it's just a very clear and focused concept. And so that's why all we're talking about today is customer acquisition. So let's get into it, right? Why are we talking about customer acquisition? It's in your business, there are 2 things that come to mind when we talk about making money, and it's revenue and profit. So revenue being your income, just everything that comes into the business money-wise, financially. And then profit being the income minus expenses. The revenue minus all the things that you had to pay to get that revenue along the way. And so the customer acquisition cost, that being the cost it takes for you to acquire a new customer, to get someone from stranger to paying for one of your clothing products. If you're able to reduce that cost, what you're doing is reducing your expenses and increasing profitability. And so that means with the same amount of revenue on paper, you're able to take home more money, or at least have more money that you can play with and use for other things. And so that's the importance of this conversation about customer acquisition costs. And I hope that throughout this podcast, I'm going to give you some very practical ways that you can increase your profitability in your streetwear brand, and therefore have more money so you can scale quicker. And I really believe that's what you're going to do. And at the end of this podcast, what I'm going to reveal to you is some ways that, or a very specific way that you can go into, that you can know exactly how much you can spend on ad spend, on content creation, on your video campaigns, on all of any kind of marketing material, because I think that's going to be very valuable for many in having the peace of mind around those topics. So let's get into it, right? I think it's important when we're talking about customer acquisition costs to speak about the sales funnel, because they're very much linked. And the sales funnel being the process of a stranger becoming a customer of yours. And so there's 3 main sections to the sales funnel, those being the top of the funnel, the middle of the funnel, and the bottom of the funnel. And forgive me if you've already heard and are well versed on these topics, on these subjects, but it's going to be important at least to cover it again, to rehash it, so you have the context for everything that's to come in this conversation. And so the top of the funnel is your strangers. It's the widest part, meaning that there's the most people there. And it's people that maybe have just been introduced to your brand. They don't know much about it. They certainly don't like you or trust you that much, right? Because people buy from those they know, like, and trust. And the only thing that's stopping them from buying from you is the fact that they don't yet know, like, or trust you. And that's okay. But hopefully they like you enough, even just a little bit, not to put their money on the table, but to stick around and see what you're about, see if it's going to be worth their time or money. And so that's when some of those people at the top of the funnel move down to the middle of the funnel. I mean, some skip along and move to the next, and others move down further into the middle of the funnel. And so this is where they're starting to gain trust. They've had some more interactions with you. They haven't yet bought anything. However, they are interested. Maybe they've seen some drops go by. Maybe they've been to your store page already and they like what they see. However, they haven't put any money on the table yet. So there's no real skin in the game other than some time that they've committed to researching your brand or consuming your content, that kind of thing. And then eventually what some of those people will do is move down the funnel a little bit further. And this is the narrowest point in the funnel, and it's often referred to as the bottom of the funnel. And these are the people that go from prospect customers to paying customers, meaning that they make the jump. They go from just being a member of your audience, someone who sees your stuff, to maybe someone who wears your stuff too, because they've gone out of their way to buy a garment, put in their credit card details. And so this is the process. This is the sales funnel. This is what it looks like, the journey for many of your customers. Everyone started at the top somewhere. Everyone started at a point where they don't know anything about your brand to now the point where they do know a lot about your brand. And the process from the top all the way to the bottom and everything in the middle is the sales funnel. And that whole process is built up of a number of interactions in amount of time that a member of your audience has spent with you. And so to link this to customer acquisition, what customer acquisition is and where it comes in is the cost to get someone from that widest point at the top all the way to the bottom where they're putting money on the table and making the cost worth it, not just an expense, but rather offsetting the expense with hopefully income that's greater than the expense to get them. And so this brings in the 7-Eleven principle, which suggests that before someone can buy from any sort of company or business, they need 7 hours of connection and 11 interactions on 11 separate occasions. And so starting with the interactions, that could look like seeing a billboard or a friend telling them about it, then your brand coming up in conversation. Could be a reel popping up on their feed, or maybe it's your name on a newsletter that they've subscribed to popping up in their inbox. They're all interactions. They all count. And all in all, some researchers have found that it's about 11 of them on average. Of course, this changes from industry to industry, and so I wouldn't take it as a hard rule. However, I would refer to it as a good way to think about how do you get someone from the top of the funnel all the way to the bottom. Was it costing customer acquisition to get them to the bottom? It's around about 11 interactions. And again, linking it to customer acquisition, every interaction, every reach out from your brand to a customer in any kind of way costs something, whether it's time or money or both, usually both, right? And so in the case of interactions, that looks like the subscription you pay to your email service provider that hosts your newsletter, or it looks like the ad spend in order to show up in someone's feed as an ad, or it counts as the billboard company that you paid to put your advertisement in the public space. All of those are interactions. They're reach outs from your brand to your audience and or prospects, people that have never been introduced to you. And all of them cost something. And so that's customer acquisition. And the other side of this is 7 hours of interaction. Again, not a hard rule. It is more of a way to think about things. I believe there is evidence behind it that suggests 7 hours is a legitimate number for some industries. However, I only want you to think about it in that you need both the time. You need time, like any relationship. To build relational equity, you need to spend time with them. And there is no different with your customers and your brand. And so that also costs money because you're having to create content now. And it's not only content that pops up in front of your people a number of times, it's also content that it's also the volume of content that's able to cover 7 hours. It means you need at least 7 hours, but probably much more than that. And again, that is where your customer acquisition costs come from. And so those two elements together, the time, the 7 hours and 11 interactions, give a good insight on how to reduce customer acquisition costs. Because now it's not some fluffy question about how do I get a customer from the top of the funnel to the bottom of the funnel cheaper, which is quite a broad question and probably a bit hard to answer. Now the question becomes, how do I get my brand in front of more people, more times, and for longer, cheaper? In other words, how do I show up in their feed more times in a less expensive way? Or how do I create a greater volume of content or allow my audience to see more of my content for longer amounts of time in less time? Like, instead of years, it might be months. And so this leads me to talking about what I see many brand owners do on Instagram. And the fact is, if you're listening to this, you probably don't have a brick and mortar store. You might, but you probably don't. And so I would call you a social media streetwear brand because you're an online store, essentially. Like, that's where nearly 100% of your customers come from Instagram, and therefore you're a social media streetwear brand. And so many of the types of posts that I see coming from these pages are short form content, and they're reach content, right? Which is good because you want to reach people at the top of the funnel, and it's great. And it's short form content about the product. It's, here's my new hoodie, and here's how to style it, and here's how it looks on models, and and some are even more creative than that. And so look, it's good content. It's not bad. It's of a high quality, of a high standard. But the problem is when I weigh up a 30-second reel against the 7 hours of interaction, of engagement between an individual and your brand, it's going to be very hard to complete those 7 hours, to obtain the 7 hours of relational equity with a customer or with a prospect customer with only 30-second reels. Like, think about it. If I just do the math quickly, 7 times 60 means that there's 420 minutes in 7 hours. And then if a reel is on average about 30 seconds, we can then divide that by 420 minutes, which means we need to multiply that by 60 again to get the number of seconds, which is 25,200 seconds, and then divide that by 30 will give us the number of reels you'd have to make to get 7 hours of content. Would be 840 reels. 840. I mean, most of you don't even have 840 posts on your feed, let alone reels. And not to mention that not every person is going to see your reel every time you post it. And so you'd most likely need double or triple that, or probably even a lot more than that. My point is orders of magnitude more than 840 reels to be able to obtain 7 hours of brand equity, of relational equity with your customers. And of course, you might say, well, no, that's not always true. Like, you could probably do it in less time than that. Yes, you are correct in saying that it's not always going to be 7 hours. However, it does give us some clues about what is required to acquire a customer, and therefore, what are we doing already that's maybe preventing us from reducing those customer acquisition costs, right? Because let's just pretend, or not pretend. Let's assume that 7 hours is correct. It's about that amount of time for all of your customers. And by the way, I don't think it's a bad assumption to make, because if you assume that it's going to take 7 hours of time with your brand for all your customers to put money on the table, you're going to be doing a lot more than you have to, in terms of you're going to be putting in a lot more input than you have to, and it's going to be a lot easier for you to acquire customers. In other words, it's much better to overestimate how much they need to become customers than underestimate, right? And so let's just play with that number and assume it's correct. It takes a lot of time and money to make 800 reels. Like a hell of a lot of time and money. And thought process, that's hours and hours, probably hundreds, more like thousands of hours for each of those pieces of content. And that's a very high customer acquisition cost, and probably not at all sustainable. And so that's why when I see brands that only have short form content, I see and I believe that they're leaving a lot of money on the table, and that the cost to acquire their customers is a lot higher than it needs to be, and therefore the profitability of their brand is lower than it could be. Meaning that they're leaving money on the table. They have more money that they could be making, that they could be taking home, that they could be using for other areas of their business, that they're not, simply because they're only making short form content. And so this is why I look to larger brands that have more resources and trying to see what are they doing. Like, of the brands that are already very successful, what are they doing to reduce customer acquisition costs? And I see a lot of large brands making long form content. Like, take Nike, for example. They are the largest business page on Instagram, right? Not even just fashion page, but business page full stop. I think they've got maybe more than 300 million followers. So they know what they're doing. Beyond that, they're also the largest and most, how do I say? They are the number one fashion brand in the world in terms of revenue. And so all I'm saying is that they know a thing or two about customers and customer acquisition. And so when I look to their page, how are they reducing their customer acquisition costs in terms of the customers that come from social media? And so they have a podcast. It's called Trained. And on there, they're talking about the lifestyle behind their brand. They're talking about mental health, physical health, and they have athletes that come on. They have mental health experts, all types of people from different walks of life come into their podcast. And each episode is between 30 minutes and an hour. And this, to me, is not just a place where they're sinking money into for no reason. Because, I mean, no company's doing that. That's dumb. No company out there is just, well, let's just do this just because. There's always a reason behind why they're doing it. And if it's not obvious, maybe you have to look a bit closer. And I truly believe the reason that they're doing this is because of a principle like the 7-Eleven principle, being that your customers need 7 hours and 11 interactions with you before they purchase. And they've realized we can't do this with just short form content, so let's make long form content. Because I don't know if you know, but it's a lot easier to accumulate 7 hours of relational equity with a customer when each interaction is over the course of 1 hour in a podcast episode, or maybe a whole documentary, which might be 90 minutes. That's a lot easier. And so this is why they're doing it, is because they're able to reduce their customer acquisition costs. And the business benefits are real behind the long form content. And because, I mean, as I've already stated, reducing customer acquisition cost means that you're able to increase profitability, which means you have more money that you're taking home and more that you can play with and put into other areas. And so I see many brands that get turned off at the idea of creating any sort of content that doesn't directly translate to sales. Because on paper, creating a podcast doesn't directly translate to sales, especially one where you're not even selling the product. You're just selling the idea, the lifestyle, the ideology, the ethos behind the brand. And so that turns a lot of brand owners off to the idea of creating a podcast or any sort of long form content. But if that is you, if you find yourself in that position today, I want to encourage you and maybe challenge you, probably mostly challenge you, that not every action in your brand has to have a profit center, meaning that not everything has to directly translate to money. In fact, it's some of the most profitable actions that aren't directly linked to profitability. And so I like to use the example of Apple Maps because, I mean, Apple, I think they're still the number one company in the world in terms of value in terms of their valuation as of recording this podcast. I could be wrong. Anyway, point is they're pretty up there. They're pretty high on the Fortune 500 companies. I mean, I'm pretty sure they're Fortune 1 or 2, right? And they invest billions of dollars into Apple Maps every single year. However, I was surprised to learn that Apple Maps doesn't make Apple any money. They don't make any money. In fact, they're losing money on Apple Maps. And so that made me raise the question, why would they continue investing in it if it was making them lose money? Right? Because think about it. I mean, much is the case, I'm sure, with Google Maps. I mean, I haven't done my research on Google Maps, so I'm not sure if they lose money on it, but I'd say they do. Because it's a free resource that they put out there. There's no ads, really, on Google Maps. I mean, yes, you can post your business, and maybe there's some ads there. I don't think they pay for that, though. I think if you can list your business on Google Maps without having to pay for your position, right? And my point being is, like, I just want you to think for a minute, why would these large companies who have so much to lose be putting money, time and money, resources into areas of the business that don't directly translate to profitability or profit? And it really comes down to a bigger picture, a longer term goal for their company. And I think about these products, these software products, and that indirectly speaking, an iPhone would be less attractive without Apple Maps on it. A Google phone would be less attractive without a highly integrated Google Maps product on it. And so although you cannot directly relate the Google Maps or Apple Maps software products to profit, you can indirectly in the sales of the Apple iPhone, for example. Because there might be people out there that without Apple Maps would never buy the iPhone. And you might call me crazy for saying that. It's like, yeah, I've never heard of anyone buy an iPhone just for Apple Maps. You're missing the point. If that's what you're thinking, you're missing the point, because it's not just about Apple Maps. It's the same attitude that's applied to all of their features inside their phone. They probably lost money creating the Face ID feature, because it's not like an upgrade you buy in your phone necessarily, that like, oh, well, you get the non-Face ID version or the Face ID version on Apple phones. So therefore you could say, well, they lost money. However, it's that feature and a number of others that, when put together, create something that's highly attractive to customers, which means that they are making money on them indirectly. And the same is true for your content, and the same is true for Nike's podcast, right? They're not selling more t-shirts just because people watch their podcast. However, what if their cultural drive in society is increasing because of their things like their podcast and other alike efforts? Or what if over the long term they have customers or people in their audience that listen to their podcast? Maybe they find Nike because of the podcast, and maybe they learn to love Nike because of the podcast and the ideas that's showing on the podcast, and they end up buying every piece of clothing that Nike releases, right? I mean, apply this to your own company. Even I think of a Spanish brand called Nude Project. They're from Barcelona. They're based in Barcelona, and they have a podcast called the Nude Project Podcast. that podcast that on their Instagram page, just the podcast Instagram page, has 130,000 followers. It's nuts. And they talk about what it means to follow your passions and have big dreams. Again, you can say the same thing. They're spending hours a week on this podcast, maybe lots of money in getting guests come out on the show, paying their engagement fees, and they're probably paying people money to edit the podcast. They may not be covering the costs in garment sales. However, if you relate this back to the 7-Eleven rule, this is counting for interactions and hours of time that they are recouping and able to reduce the customer acquisition costs through something like a podcast, a long form piece of content. And for that reason, it's worth their time and money, and it is indirectly profitable. And so I say that whole spiel for the last 10 minutes only to suggest that don't be so quick to forego business efforts that don't directly link to profitability, because more times than not, the ones that you're not able to link directly to making more money indirectly make the most money. And it's really funny like that, because like most things in business, sometimes things are really counterintuitive. I think marketing is counterintuitive, and I think this is one of those other things. And so if you're scratching your head, you say, well, I don't want to release a podcast. That's okay. You don't have to release a podcast, but consider the 7-hour principle, not the rule, but the principle, and think, what's a piece of content that I could make in the long form that is on brand to me and that feels right for what I'm doing? And I think podcasting is great because it's one of the easiest ways you can do it. I mean, this is my own podcast. I spend no longer than 2 hours a week, right? It's more or less uncut. It's pretty raw. And I mean, of course, as I said at the beginning of this episode, this is my second take, so sometimes it takes longer. I don't usually do 2 takes. In fact, I think this is the only time I've done a second take. And so that's why I think podcasting is one of the easiest ones, because you need very little resources. You can, if you've got a phone and voice memos, you can record a podcast. If you know some people that embody your brand and the lifestyle behind your brand, just having conversations with them. And you've got a long form piece of content. So that's why I think podcasting is great. But if you've got the resources, create films and if you want documentaries, if it applies to the lifestyle behind your brand and the ideology that you're selling, or create long form text resources like a blog, for example. I mean, if you posted a blog once a week, again, like all of these things that I'm talking about, they're not really about selling your product. They're about selling the brand or selling the idea behind the product. And so if you had a blog once a week that was between 200 and 1,000 words, well, there you go. Over the span of a year, you have what's equivalent to a book there. And all about this concept that is your brand, that is your lifestyle, that's your ethos or ideology. And so this is one way you can reduce customer acquisition costs by creating long form content. It's by increasing the number of hours that your audience is interacting with your brand with long form content. And it's one that's, I think, it's often overlooked. Coming to the other side of this with 11 interactions, a lot of people don't. I see some issues with some brands in that they focus more on the ad spend more than organic content. And the issue with that is that it's a couple of things. Ad spend, well, first of all, it's expensive, right? It's more expensive. Organic content is basically free, right? So it's more expensive. And the other thing about ad spend is that it's usually product focused, which means it has one goal, and it's getting people from the middle of the funnel to the bottom of the funnel. In other words, getting people that already know about your brand to pay for the product. And so it has one focus. It doesn't even worry about acquiring new audience members that don't yet know about your brand, that don't yet know, like, or trust you. And so this is like, on the contrary, brands that focus on organic content have this amazing asset where they're getting in 11 interactions with their audience virtually free. Virtually free. Because you don't have to pay for organic. Anyone can upload a reel. And the reason I'm talking about this is because when on the topic of customer acquisition, trying to get strangers to become customers, and taking the time to actually, and making the effort to do the things that you need to do in order to make them a customer, you can do so with organic content. And I think this links well. I get the question a lot. How do I make content when I'm not dropping any clothes? This applies to anyone who hasn't dropped a clothing collection yet, or maybe is in between two clothing collections or two clothing pieces, in that you haven't got anything to drop right now, and therefore you stop posting. The solution to doing that is posting something that goes beyond your garment. Think about what can I post about my brand? Like, nearly all the brands I talk to, even if they don't embody it or talk about it much publicly, everyone has some idea in the back of their head about what their brand means more than the clothing. It's usually in the brand name. And because I'll say, okay, what does your brand name mean? And they'll tell me that it's about, it could be about like getting outside, or it could be about like positive mental health, or, the ups and the downs of life, or being unique. Like, all of these things are actual things I've heard from brand owners about what they're telling me about their brand, their brand name. And I often, I find it almost comical that they tell me this, and I've never known that. I've never seen anything about the concept that they're telling me about. And so this uncovers the solution for what do you post when you don't have clothing to drop. Well, simply post content about what your brand is about. And so let me take the example of being unique. Like, I think I can't remember the brand name. Maybe I won't share it anyway, but I can't remember it, even if I wanted to. But yeah, anyway, so there's a brand owner. I asked him, okay, what does your brand name mean? This is what I do to help them with their content strategy. It's one of the first questions I asked. What does your brand name mean? And he told me it's about being unique, like not being a sheep following everyone else, sticking out of the crowd and being proud of that. And so what I can pull from that, like, this is just off the top of my head, the content that I could make about that as a brand owner if I wasn't dropping any clothes. First thing I'd do is I'd catastrophize it. So if it's about being unique, I want to imagine a world where everyone is exactly the same. How horrible would that be? And so I can imagine, like, in that world where everyone's exactly the same. Okay, let me just imagine it for a second. What is in that world where everyone is exactly the same? Everyone's a clone of each other. I think it would be pretty annoying, like monotonous. That's what I think it would be. Be monotonous because there's nothing unique about it. No one would feel special. Everyone would feel so unimportant. And so by catastrophizing it, what I have is a conflict, and a conflict to a story. And so stories are shareable, and stories are the kind of content that you want to be making about your brand lifestyle. And so what I do then is go out there and find stories and think of stories that I could tell where the conflict is something to do with of this monotonous life where everything is the same. So maybe I'd find someone who I believe is so unique, is so themselves, and they can tell their story, in the conflict being, once upon a time, I wanted to fit in like everyone else until I realized how horrible it was. And I felt so unimportant and so not special. And that's the people I hung around with. And that's what they brought out of me too. They didn't make me feel special at all. But now I found I was able to find myself and express myself and be okay with being unique by XYZ. These reasons. This is how I did it. And so now I feel important and I feel loved and valued, and I know who really cares about me. I know who my true friends are. So this, for example, is a story that someone could tell in a number of ways. You could ask someone this question walking out on the street. You could do an interview with someone. You could do a short film. You could do a stop motion animation. You could just post a series of pictures that represent this, or just post portraits. Or maybe, you could be more abstract with it. You could go out and maybe there's a photographer out there that that likes to embody the idea of loneliness or uniqueness in their photos. So these are there's hundreds and hundreds of ways you can embody the story or tell the story. But you can see how there's stories in here, and this is what you can do when you don't know what to post, when you're not dropping any clothes and you still want to get in some of those customer interactions to reduce the customer acquisition cost. And this is the kind of thing you post. So just to summarize, this might work for you, this might not. But if it does for you, what does your brand name mean? What's the meaning behind your brand name? Why have you called it what you have? And then within that brand name, within that meaning, catastrophize it. Think, what is the worst case scenario if this didn't exist, or if the opposite of this exists? And then you have your conflict for every story that you're going to tell. Find that conflict and look for stories or create stories where that conflict is at the center in different ways, that the details are a bit different every time. And then work out how you're going to present it. Usually through a piece of content, but is it going to be through an art piece? Is it going to be through an interview, a documentary, a narrative? Is it going to be through photos, videos, text, blog? Is it going to be through portrait? Whatever. Just get creative with all of the ways. Dream about the ways you could represent that story for your brand, because I promise there's a way you can do that that's on brand to you, because not every way is going to be on brand to you. And that links into customer acquisition, because it's that kind of content that gets shared. Also, because people share stories. Stories are shareable because we connect with them, and people find it difficult to connect with products, but not with stories. And so this is another way that it links to customer acquisition, is that when someone shares it, it's equivalent to word of mouth. On Instagram, when they hit the little paper airplane and share it on their story, that is no different from word of mouth. It's saying, hey, check this out. I thought this was pretty cool. You might like it too. Those people that your customers or your audience are reaching, their friends, your audience's friends, they represent it in the top of the funnel. And so this is another great way to get content. Different content pieces have different purposes for different parts of the funnel. And stories have a great purpose in reaching the top of funnel because they're so shareable. And so that's another way it links in, not only in getting in those interactions and getting that time with your customers, that's 7 hours with your customers, with your audience, but also in reaching new audiences and bringing them from the top of the funnel eventually to the bottom. So my actionable, if you're going to take away anything away from this, I want you to think of some ways today that you can make some long form content in your brand. And the way you can do that is by dreaming up stories. Think about what your brand means beyond your clothing. What's the lifestyle, the unique ideology, ethos, or lifestyle behind your brand? What does your clothing represent? And that is where your stories are. Tell stories about that through long form content. If you don't know where to start really on long form content, create a podcast. Just do it. Make the jump, because it's the easiest one of anything that I can find, that I can think of. And yeah, it's a really great way. I've seen it work really well for a lot of brands. And the thing is, it's not a copycat, you making a podcast like every other brand is, because your podcast is not going to be about the same thing as theirs is. And so that's why you can do it, and it's not copycat. So yeah, I hope that this idea of creating long form content and customer acquisition has been encouraging to you today, and maybe challenge you in some ways that you can increase profitability and the amount of money that you're making in your brand, by by doing things that don't necessarily or directly relate to making more money, but indirectly they make you the most. I hope this was really helpful. Please, if you have any questions or comments on this podcast or any other episode, you're welcome to email me and ask those questions or make the comments. You can do so at lige@elijahdelporte.com. LIJ@elijahdelporte.com. Lige, by the way, is my nickname. So you're welcome to call me Lige too if you like, since we're friends. But yes, please send me an email. My inbox is always open. And look, just before I leave, I've been working on a project that you've probably heard of if you've consumed any of my content. I've been working on it for a while, and it's a community on School called Streetwear 365. And the purpose of this community is to help streetwear entrepreneurs turn their side hustle into a full-time career. It's been a great space. I've been so loving seeing people, the brand owners interact. Like, brand owners are asking questions about how do I stop my sales from fluctuating, like going up and down and not staying so consistent. And other brand owners are asking for feedback on their website, like if people can take a look at their store page and provide some tips on how to improve it and strengthen and improve conversion rates. And there's a lot of people that are using the space, a lot of brand owners are using the space to stay motivated and do the work and put in the hours. And so it's really great, and I wanted to invite you to join. It is 100% free to join. You can find the link to join in the notes below this podcast, wherever you're listening or watching from, in the description section. Or you can go to elijahdelporte.com/pro. And I do want to let you know I have two communities. One is a free one and one is a paid one. And the main difference between the two is that I have a course called the Streetwear 365 Masterclass. It's 5 modules helping you turn your side hustle into a full-time career. And the free community gets module 1 for free, and the paid community gets all of the modules. And there's I'm still working on it. I'm still releasing it, in the process of releasing it. But the pro community, I'm letting the first 10 members in for free. I've just opened the pro community. As we speak, there's 4 members in there. And so that means there's 6 free spots left, free for life, I will add. And after that, the price will raise. So if you're interested in getting in to the pro community, please go ahead and check that out. I hope that spots haven't filled out by the time you're listening to this episode. Obviously, it depends. But the free community is there, and for everyone, it's provide a heap of value to lots of people. I think that's at 50 members at the moment. So join the 50 plus other streetwear entrepreneurs that are absolutely killing it, that are making their dream streetwear brand a reality. So simply, again, look at the description of the video for the link to that, and you can join 100% free. I look forward to seeing you on the inside. I'll be there to welcome you and greet you. And thanks very much for listening to this episode of Street Cred. I will see you next week for another episode.